I worked seasonal search and rescue out of a remote ranger station in the backcountry of Yellowstone National Park, a place so isolated that after sunset the silence settles in like something physical, pressing against the windows and creeping into the corners of the cabin. And most nights the only sounds you hear are wind combing through the lodgepole pines and the distant rush of the Lamar River moving through the valley below. But the summer this happened, we were short-staffed, and I was often alone for long shifts at the Slow Creek Outpost, a small, weathered ranger station about 12 miles from the nearest paved road, where hikers occasionally checked in but most days passed without seeing another person. And the case that still bothers me started on a gray afternoon in late September, when a radio call came through from the main ranger station about a missing backpacker who had failed to return from a 3-day trip through the Absaroka wilderness. His name was Daniel Mercer, 32, experienced hiker, according to his permit notes, and the last confirmed sighting was a couple from Minnesota who passed him near a backcountry trail junction 2 days earlier, heading deeper into a stretch of forest that locals sometimes call the Black Timber because the canopy grows so thick that sunlight barely reaches the ground even at noon. And since I was the closest ranger, they asked me to start a preliminary sweep along the trail network around my station until a larger search team could arrive the next morning, which was routine enough except the weather had shifted fast that day. Heavy clouds rolling down from the mountains and the temperature dropping with that damp autumn cold that seeps through your jacket. And by the time I started hiking the trail, the woods already felt darker than they should have been for late afternoon. The kind of dimness where every fallen log looks like something crouching and every branch snap echoes farther than it should. And for the first hour, everything was normal. Just the steady crunch of gravel into my boots and the occasional elk call echoing across the valley. But about 2 miles from the station, I started noticing something strange along the trail. Small pieces of bright orange survey tape tied loosely to branches about every 100 yards or so. The kind of tape search teams use to mark areas they've already checked. Except no search teams had been deployed yet, and the tape looked fresh, not weathered, fluttering in the breeze like someone had tied it there only hours earlier. And at first I assumed maybe another ranger had started ahead of me without calling it in. But when I radioed the main station, they told me no one else was in that sector yet, which left me standing alone on that quiet trail with the wind rustling through those orange ribbons and a feeling settling in my chest that something about the situation wasn't lining up right. Because the tape didn't follow a search pattern either. It just continued straight down the trail into thicker forest, almost like a path someone wanted followed. And against my better judgment, I kept going, because if Mercer had placed it himself, maybe he was marking his route after getting lost. But the deeper I moved into the trees, the quieter everything became, until even the birds seemed to disappear. And about another mile in, I found the first real sign of the missing hiker, his backpack sitting upright beside the trail, as if someone had carefully set it down there, not tossed or dropped, just placed beside a large pine, with the straps facing outward. And when I approached, I noticed the pack was fully loaded with his gear still inside, sleeping bag, stove, even his water filter, which immediately made no sense, because no experienced backpacker abandons all their supplies in the middle of the wilderness, unless something has gone very wrong. And while I was kneeling there examining it, I noticed the orange tape continued deeper off the trail into the forest itself, tied from tree to tree now in a deliberate line leading downhill toward a darker stretch of woods, where the ground dipped into a narrow ravine. And I remember standing there debating whether to follow it immediately or mark the location and head back before nightfall, because by then the light was fading fast into the cloud cover. But curiosity and that stubborn ranger instinct pushed me forward, and I started following the tape down into the ravine, where the trees grew closer together and the air felt colder. And that's when I began hearing something else mixed in with the wind, a faint rhythmic sound that I first thought was a branch knocking against another branch, but as I got closer it became clearer, slower, deliberate, like someone tapping wood against wood every few seconds somewhere ahead in the darkness. And I called out for Mercer a couple times, my voice echoing oddly between the trees, but the tapping didn't stop or respond. It just continued, steadily deeper in the ravine, and eventually the tape ended at a small clearing where the ground had been disturbed like several people had walked through recently. And in the center of the clearing was a crude structure built from fallen branches leaning against a tree, almost like a child's idea of a shelter. Except the inside of it was lined with more orange tape, tied in loops and knots that hung from the sticks like strange decorations. And I remember feeling that cold realization that none of this looked like the work of a lost backpacker trying to survive the night. It looked staged, arranged, deliberate, in a way that made the quiet forest suddenly feel a lot less empty than it had a few minutes earlier. And when I stepped closer to inspect it, I found Mercer's hiking boots sitting just outside the shelter entrance, placed neatly side by side as if he had taken them off before going inside. Except when I shined my flashlight into the structure, it was completely empty. Just dirt and pine needles and more strips of tape hanging loosely from the branches. And that's when the tapping sound stopped abruptly behind me, somewhere deeper in the trees. Not ahead anymore, but behind me where the trail back to the ranger station was. And I turned slowly, expecting maybe another ranger had arrived. But the forest was just rows of dark trunks fading into shadow. No movement, no voices, just that thick quiet that makes you suddenly aware of how far you are from anyone else. And I radioed again, asking if anyone had entered the ravine from the north side, but the signal was breaking up now, the mountains interfering with the transmission, so all I got back was static and fragments of voices. And while I was standing there trying to get a clearer signal, I noticed another piece of orange tape tied to a branch, only a few feet away, except this one hadn't been there when I walked into the clearing. I was certain of it because it hung directly across the line of sight where I'd been scanning earlier, and it swayed slightly, like it had just been tied moments before. And that was the first moment I had the unmistakable feeling that someone else was in that ravine with me, moving quietly between the trees while I was distracted. And I called out again, louder this time, identifying myself as a ranger. But the woods stayed silent except for the wind, and the longer I stood there, the more I noticed subtle things that hadn't registered at first. Faint footprints around the clearing that looked too large to be Mercer's hiking boots. Broken branches at shoulder height, like someone tall had been pushing through the undergrowth. And several more strips of tape higher in the trees where a person would need to reach up and tie them. Almost as if the markers weren't meant to guide someone walking the ground, but someone observing from a distance. And I decided right then I needed to head back to the station before dark and wait for the full search team in the morning. But as I climbed out of the ravine, following the tape line back toward the trail, I started noticing something that made the back of my neck prickle, because the pieces of tape I had already passed were gone now, not fallen to the ground, but completely missing from the branches where they had been tied earlier. And the further I walked, the more obvious it became that someone was removed behind me as I moved forward, erasing the path I had followed into the forest. And I picked up my pace after that, keeping my flashlight sweeping through the trees even though the last of the daylight was still filtering through the canopy. And about halfway back to the trail, I heard footsteps matching mine somewhere off to my left, moving parallel through the brush. Slow, deliberate steps that stopped every time I stopped and resumed when I started walking again. And I remember the feeling of that isolation hitting me harder than it ever had before. Because in a place like that, you realize how easy it would be for someone to watch you without ever being seen. And when I finally reached the main trail, I didn't slow down. I headed straight back toward the ranger station, with the fading light turning the forest into silhouettes. And for most of the hike back, the woods stayed quiet, except for my own breathing and the wind. But just before the station came into view through the trees, I heard that tapping sound again behind me on the trail. 2 slow knocks of wood against wood, echoing through the dark forest. And when I turned around with my flashlight, there was no one there, just a single strip of bright orange tape tied neatly to the trail sign that hadn't been there earlier that day, fluttering in the cold evening wind. I had already been working search and rescue in the backcountry of Glacier National Park for nearly 6 years, when I was assigned a temporary post at the Kintner Lake Ranger Station, a remote wooden outpost tucked deep in the northwest corner of the park near the Canadian border, where the forest grows so thick and the mountains press so close that even during summer, the place feels strangely cut off from the rest of the world. And during the fall season, it becomes even quieter because the last of the tourists disappear, and the only people who pass through are the occasional long-distance hikers attempting sections of the Northern Divide Trail. Which is exactly why I was there that October, when a call came in about a solo backpacker named Emily Rhodes, who had failed to check out of her permit route after 4 days. And at first the situation didn't seem especially unusual, because hikers sometimes extend their trips or take longer routes without updating their itinerary. But the ranger at headquarters mentioned something that made the case different, which was that another group of hikers had reported seeing Emily 2 days earlier walking away from the trail entirely, heading straight into the forest as if she was following something. And when they called out to ask if she needed help, she apparently ignored them and kept walking without even turning around, which immediately raised concerns because experienced hikers don't just wander off established trails in terrain like that, unless something is wrong. And since my station was only a few miles from the area where she'd last been spotted, I was asked to start the initial ground search before the larger team could arrive the following morning. So just after sunrise, I packed my gear, grabbed the handheld radio, and started along the Bowman Lake Trail where the hikers said they'd last seen her. And I remember the air being unusually still that morning, the kind of silence where the forest seems to absorb every sound so that even your footsteps feel too loud. And after hiking for about an hour, I reached the section of trail where the report had come from, a narrow stretch where the trees grow so close together they form a dark corridor with very little undergrowth on the forest floor, which made it easy to see the set of boot prints leaving the trail and heading directly into the woods at a sharp angle. And I followed them slowly because the prints were clear enough in the soft soil to track without difficulty. But after about 20 minutes, something strange became obvious. The boot prints continued in a straight line deeper into the forest with almost unnatural consistency. No wandering, no hesitation, just step after step spaced evenly as if Emily had been walking in a trance. And what made it even stranger was that there were no return tracks, and no sign she had stopped or set up camp anywhere along the route. She had simply continued moving deeper into the trees until the terrain began sloping downward toward a narrow valley, where a small ranger maintenance cabin had been abandoned decades earlier. A place locals sometimes mention in passing but few people actually visit, because the roof partially collapsed years ago, and the trail leading to it was never maintained. And when I finally reached the clearing where the old cabin stood, I immediately felt that uneasy shift in the atmosphere that experienced rangers learn to recognize, that subtle sense that something about the environment isn't quite right. Because the door to the cabin was standing open, and the ground around it was covered in footprints. Not just Emily's small boot prints, but larger ones too. Dozens of them overlapping each other in the dirt, as if multiple people had been walking around the structure recently. And for a moment I thought maybe other hikers had found the place before me. But the footprints didn't lead back toward the trail. They circled the cabin repeatedly before disappearing into the forest in several directions, like spokes on a wheel. And I remember calling out Emily's name as I approached the doorway, but the inside of the cabin was silent and dark, except for the sound of wind moving through the broken roof boards. And when I stepped inside, I saw her backpack sitting on the floor against the wall, fully packed, just like the last case I'd worked, with the zipper closed and her water bottle still clipped to the side. And it immediately struck me as wrong, because again, no experienced hiker would abandon their pack unless they were in serious trouble. And while I was examining it, I noticed something else that made the situation even stranger. Because carved into the wooden floorboards were dozens of shallow scratches, forming long, uneven lines, almost like someone had been dragging something heavy across the floor again and again. And the scratches all pointed toward the far corner of the cabin, where a trapdoor used to lead to an old storage cellar underneath the building, except the trapdoor itself had been removed at some point, leaving only a dark square opening in the floor that descended into complete blackness below. And when I shined my flashlight down into it, I saw the dirt floor of the cellar, about 6 feet below, along with more of those drag marks leading deeper into a narrow tunnel that extended under the cabin foundation, which made no sense, because the original cellar should have been just a single storage pit, not a tunnel stretching off into the earth. And the more I looked, the more I realized someone had been digging down there for a long time, widening the space beneath the cabin until it formed a crude passageway disappearing into darkness. And while I was standing there deciding whether to climb down and investigate further, I heard something outside the cabin that made me freeze completely. The unmistakable sound of slow footsteps crunching through the dry leaves just beyond the doorway. And at first I assumed another ranger from the main search team had arrived early. So I stepped outside expecting to see someone approaching through the trees. But the clearing was empty, except for the cold morning fog drifting between the trunks. And the footsteps stopped the moment I came outside, as if whoever had been walking had suddenly gone still. And I called out, identifying myself again. But there was no response, only the faint creak of branches swaying overhead. And after several seconds I heard another sound that was even worse than the footsteps, because it came from beneath the cabin floor behind me. A slow scraping noise echoing up through the open trapdoor like something moving through the dirt tunnel below. And when I turned back toward the doorway, the sound stopped instantly, leaving the interior silent again. And for a long moment I just stood there listening to the quiet forest, trying to convince myself it had been an animal, maybe a badger or a wolverine, using the tunnel as a den. But the scratches on the floorboards and the number of footprints around the cabin made that explanation feel less and less likely. And eventually, I forced myself to climb back inside and approach the opening in the floor with my flashlight aimed down into the darkness. And I called Emily's name again, hoping maybe she had fallen down there and needed help. But the beam of light only illuminated the dirt walls of the tunnel, stretching several yards away before curving out of sight. And as I stared into it, I noticed something else moving at the edge of the light. Not an animal exactly, but a brief flicker of shadow further down the passage, as if someone had quickly shifted deeper into the darkness the moment the flashlight beam reached them. And that was the moment the radio at my shoulder crackled with a broken transmission from the main ranger station, asking for my location update. And when I answered, I could hear voices talking faintly in the background on their end, saying that another hiker had just reported seeing a woman matching Emily's description walking along the Bowman Lake Trail again about 15 minutes earlier, which made absolutely no sense, because I was standing there inside an abandoned cabin staring down at her backpack sitting on the floor. And while I tried to process that information, the scraping sound started again beneath the cabin, slower this time, moving deeper through the tunnel, as if whatever had been down there had decided to retreat further, underground. And when the search team finally arrived later that afternoon, they helped me explore the tunnel beneath the cabin, but it extended only about 20 yards before collapsing into a narrow crawl space that none of us could pass through, and we never found Emily roads anywhere in that valley. But the detail that has always bothered me the most is what one of the other rangers pointed out just before we left the site, which was that the dozens of footprints circling the cabin earlier that morning had all been the exact same size and shape, the same boot pattern repeated over and over again, as if the entire clearing had been walked by a single person moving in circles for hours before disappearing back into the forest. By the time I transferred to a winter rotation at the Mays District Ranger Station in Canyonlands National Park, I had already worked enough search and rescue operations across different parks to understand that isolation changes the way people behave, both the ones who get lost and sometimes the ones who come looking for them. But nothing in my previous years prepared me for the case that started in early November, when a group of 3 backpackers failed to return from a multi-day route through the maze itself, one of the most remote and disorienting wilderness regions in the United States, where sandstone canyons twist and branch so unpredictably that even experienced hikers can lose their sense of direction after only a few turns. And the ranger station where I was posted sat nearly 30 miles from the nearest paved road, perched above a wide desert basin where the wind carried sand across the rock like faint whispers at night. And when the report came in, it didn't immediately seem unusual, because hikers missing a return time by a day or two happens often in terrain like that. But what made this situation different was that another solo backpacker had stumbled into the station late the previous evening, visibly shaken, claiming he had seen someone watching his campsite from the cliffs above during the night. A tall figure standing completely still for hours without ever approaching or leaving. And when the hiker finally shined his flashlight toward the cliff, the figure disappeared behind the rock, and he heard footsteps moving away somewhere along the ledge above him, which at the time I assumed was probably one of the missing backpackers trying to avoid contact for whatever reason, maybe embarrassed about getting lost, or simply not wanting help yet. But the following morning, when I checked the permit log and confirmed the missing trio's planned route, it became clear the sighting location was nowhere near where they were supposed to be hiking, which meant whoever had been watching that campsite likely wasn't one of them. And since I was the closest ranger to that sector, I packed enough supplies for an overnight search and headed into the canyon system before sunrise, descending a narrow sandstone path that wound between towering rock walls stained dark from centuries of desert storms. And the maze has a particular kind of silence, unlike forests or mountains, because the rock absorbs and redirects sound in strange ways, so that even your breathing can echo faintly through the passageways. And as I followed the hikers' planned route markers through the canyon, I kept noticing subtle signs that someone else had been moving through the area recently. Faint boot prints in patches of sand where no official trails existed, and occasional scraps of cloth tied loosely around small rock spires, like improvised markers, which isn't uncommon for lost hikers trying to track their route, except these markers were spaced in a strange pattern that didn't lead toward any known exit points or water sources. Instead, they formed irregular loops through several side canyons, almost like someone had been deliberately circling the same territory again and again. And around midday, I reached the place where the 3 missing hikers had supposedly planned to camp according to their permit notes, a narrow canyon alcove sheltered from the wind, where the ground was covered with smooth sand and scattered boulders. And right away, I could see evidence that they had indeed stayed there at some point, because the remains of a small fire pit sat near the canyon wall, along with a flattened patch of sand where a tent had likely been pitched. But what caught my attention immediately were the footprints around the campsite, because there were far more than 3 sets. Dozens of overlapping tracks leading in and out of the alcove from different directions, as if several people had approached the campsite during the night while the hikers were asleep. And at first I tried to convince myself it could have been other backpackers passing through the canyon, but the maze rarely sees more than a handful of visitors in an entire week, and the sheer number of prints didn't match that explanation. And while I was examining the site, I noticed something else that made my stomach drop slightly, because several of the footprints were positioned along the top edge of the canyon wall, about 15 feet above the campsite, where someone could stand and look directly down into the alcove below without being seen from the ground. And the sand there showed clear impressions of someone pacing slowly back and forth along that ledge for a long period of time. And suddenly, the solo hiker's story about the silent figure watching from the cliffs didn't feel like exaggeration anymore. It felt like a warning I hadn't taken seriously enough, and I decided to continue following the route the 3 missing hikers would have taken, leaving the alcove, which led deeper into a labyrinth of narrower slot canyons where the sunlight barely reached the floor and the air cooled noticeably even during the afternoon. And as I moved through those winding passages, the feeling of being observed kept creeping back into my mind, because every time I rounded a bend, I would find new footprints in the sand ahead of me that hadn't been there in the previous section, as if someone had been walking just slightly ahead of my position, staying out of sight around the next corner. And several times I stopped completely and listened, hoping to hear movement echoing through the canyon walls, but the desert stayed silent, except for the distant moan of wind passing through narrow rock gaps high above. And eventually the canyon opened into a wider basin surrounded by steep cliffs, where I found the first actual item belonging to the missing hikers, a stainless steel water bottle lying on its side half buried in sand near the base of a rock formation. And when I picked it up, I noticed the cap had been removed and placed carefully beside it, like someone had deliberately arranged it there, rather than dropping it accidentally. And that detail unsettled me more than I expected, because it felt staged in the same strange way as the other search cases I'd worked, where belongings appeared almost displayed rather than lost. And while I was kneeling there, examining the bottle, I heard something shift above me on the cliffs. A faint scrape of loose rock, followed by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps, moving slowly along the ridgeline overhead. And when I looked up, I caught a brief glimpse of a person standing against the sky, on the edge of the cliff, maybe 40 feet above the basin, tall and thin, with a large pack on their back. But the moment I called out and raised my hand to signal them, the figure stepped away from the edge and disappeared behind a rock outcropping without saying a word. And I immediately started climbing the steep slope toward the ridge, hoping to intercept them, because if that person had information about the missing hikers, I needed to talk to them. But by the time I reached the top of the ridge, the area was empty, except for a series of boot prints heading away along the sandstone plateau toward another canyon opening. And what made the situation even stranger was that the boot prints matched none of the patterns listed in the missing hikers' gear descriptions, meaning whoever I had just seen likely wasn't part of the group we were searching for. And as I followed those prints across the plateau, I began noticing more of those cloth markers tied around small rock formations, forming a rough path leading toward a deep canyon crack that dropped sharply into darkness below. And by the time I reached the edge, the sun was already lowering behind the cliffs, casting long shadows across the rock. And when I looked down into the canyon, I saw a narrow ledge halfway along the wall, where several backpacks had been arranged in a neat row, facing outward toward the open desert. 3 of them matching the descriptions of the missing hikers' gear exactly. And for a moment I just stared down at them, trying to understand why anyone would place all their packs on a ledge like that, instead of keeping them during a hike. And then I noticed something even more disturbing about the scene, because sitting directly behind the backpacks on the rock wall were 3 shallow depressions in the dust, shaped roughly like human footprints, except they were positioned facing the canyon wall rather than the open drop behind them, almost as if the hikers had been standing there for a long time, staring directly into the rock before leaving their packs behind. And while I was trying to process that detail, I heard movement again somewhere behind me on the plateau, a slow crunch of sand under boots, followed by the sound stopping abruptly the moment I turned around. And this time when I scanned the horizon, I caught sight of not just one figure, but 2, standing far out along the ridge, watching in complete silence, both tall silhouettes against the fading sunset light, and neither of them moved or responded when I shouted asking if they had seen the missing hikers. They simply stood there motionless for several seconds, before one of them slowly turned and began walking away along the ridgeline, while the other remained facing my direction a moment longer, before disappearing behind the rock. And by the time I reached that spot minutes later, the plateau was empty again, except for a long line of footprints leading away toward the northern canyons. And when the full search team joined me the next morning, we recovered the 3 backpacks from the ledge, exactly where I had seen them, but we never found the hikers themselves, anywhere in the maze. And the part that has never sat right with me, even years later, is what one of the helicopter pilots told us after surveying the area from above that evening, which was that the cloth markers scattered through the canyon system didn't just form random loops like we originally thought. They formed an enormous pattern, visible only from the air, a wide spiral stretching across several miles of desert rock, with the abandoned campsite near its center, and the canyon ledge where the backpacks were found, positioned precisely at the outermost edge. As if whoever had been placing those markers throughout the maze had been slowly guiding something or someone outward through the labyrinth, until they finally reached the rim and then simply vanished beyond it into the empty desert.